Financially, just pass it around. Alrighty, so how we doing? It's Monday and it's rainy. Do you have any idea the sheer moral power it took to get me out of bed? Like I sat there for an hour, lied there, catatonic for an hour, and was like, it's too early in the semester to cancel class. So that's why we're all here today. Well, so we're all heroes together. But yeah, let's get started. So, how do you all find? I think looks like most of you got to the quiz. Same as last time. More difficult, less difficult. Alrighty. So, okay. What are the three activities that Arendt is going to talk about in this book?
Action was one labor.
Alrighty. So you've got the three fundamental activities. Why are they fundamental? Well, they're closely related to the fundamental conditions, but also these are for a long time, at least in the history of philosophy. So maybe not necessarily today in these words, but for a long time in the history of philosophy, it was just thought these are things which everyone can do, basically, right? So they're fundamental in the sense that they're available to basically all humans. That doesn't, I guess, mean that all humans do them all the time, but that they're fundamental to the kinds of beings we are. But they have underlying conditions, and we'll talk about this word condition a bit more from a number of different angles. But what is the sort of corresponding condition that makes sense of labor? So we can sort of guess that there's going to be there's three things on this side. There's going to be at least three corresponding conditions. So what are, for any of them, right? What are the conditions corresponding to either work, action, or labor? Okay, so so life is the underlying human condition of labor. How about work and action? Okay, so worldliness is the condition of work. And how about action? Yeah. And so totally okay if these are these it is not clear how these match yet, but for right. So, and like I said, everything except for your final exam is always going to be essentially open book. If you've got your books, it's like you could, in a lot of these cases, you could just read it and that would be okay. Like if not, it's not cheating or anything. But so what do you think it means to say that that the human condition of labor is life itself, or that the condition for or of labor is life? Did that make sense to anyone? Okay, so but before we do that, because then before we do the litany of the conditions, let's talk about what is a condition. Because I think I mentioned last time, and I'm going to let you guys know right now, I forget who I say things to, because I experience the whole world as one big other. And so I know that a lot of times I know that I said something somewhere to someone, but if I often just think I'm like, it was you all, right? But if it wasn't just like, no, we don't have no idea what you're talking about, it could have been the other class. But I said that I think last time that this book, The Human Condition, is an example of what we can call philosophical anthropology. So anthropologists, the scientists anthropologists, study the human species and its relatives and our bones and our physical record and the fossil record and all of that cool stuff. Philosophical anthropology is the area of philosophy that's sort of asking from the philosophical angle, what's the human? What are those human things? And what does it mean to be human, right? And in case it wasn't obvious, because I'm sure that like many things I haven't made it obvious yet, part of why we're taking this approach to contemporary moral issues is because, as I've said before, it's usual to just begin talking about the hot button things after showering you with a little bit of theory. and thereby exacerbating whatever opinions or feels you already have. If we approach it this way, we're going to be interested, if we really want to talk intelligently about morality or ethics or all the other things and how they connect, we want to get a good grip rather on not the whole answer to what it is to be human. Like this isn't like your life story or anything, but approaching this from what kind of creatures are we? How do we understand what we are? So as philosophical anthropology, that's kind of what the project, or incidentally, that's what this book is going to display, because we're going to learn a lot about humans from a philosophical angle in the process of looking at the history of how things got to be the way they are and why we kind of think in some of the ways that we do, right? So the traditional, holy grail of philosophical anthropology, traditionally, historically, has been, we want to know about human nature, right? I know we use that term a lot. You might throw it around, and like often we appeal to human nature when we're trying to explain things. Like we might say, well, it's just human nature to insert whatever we're trying to justify or explain here, right? So, however, this idea of nature is going to be really problematic for reasons that we'll see throughout the book. So she's still very interested in the human, but we're taking it from a different angle. Rather than looking at what human nature is, we're looking at, in her terms, the human condition, right? So what's a condition in general? And it's okay, there's a number of definitions, right? But like, if I just asked you, what's a condition? What might you guys say? So if I ask you, like, so-and-so's in the hospital, what condition is he in? What does condition mean there? Yeah, how is he? Right? Like, so one way of, like, this is a needlessly fancy way of putting it, but one way we talk about conditions as modes of being, which, like, what's your name? Ryan. So like Ryan said, the state, right? How about, I'm going to do this, but only on the condition that, what does condition mean there? Yeah. Requirement, sometimes we call that a stipulation, right? Okay. Yeah, so condition sometimes means a state, just how the thing is, like what its general state is. And it also a condition can be a requirement of something we stipulate, like a prerequisite almost, right? Like it's a condition of taking, I assume, like Cal 2, I don't know these things, that you have taken Cal 1 or something, right? Or past it. Like, so, and there's a couple other ways. Now, what if I'm going to condition you? Like back in PE, or like, in psychotherapy, what does condition mean there? Like train. Yeah. So that in that sense, it's sort of like train. It's probably the best word for it at the moment. There might be other equivalents, but so in a large, broader sense, condition can kind of, along those lines, also mean sort of get used to, right? So we're going to be talking about, although Arendt's not going to be very clear in exactly which sense all the time, you want to keep this sort of constellation of meanings in your head, because the point is that condition can mean a number of things, but they all have to do with, it seems, either talking about the way something is or how it's changing or being affected, right? My condition before having caffeine in the morning is moribund, right? My condition after is significantly more vivacious. Coffee, by the way. So if we wanted to talk about in terms of human conditions, then let's see how might we relate labor to life. So life might be a requirement of labor in some sense. It might have to involve some sort of training or getting used to, or it might just be talking about a state, right? But long story short for some of these, instead of talking about human nature, and we're going to talk more about nature in a bit, but we're just talking about what are the conditions that humans are in, right? Last time we talked about, I think, right, we did the whole thing on taking for granted. We talked about the weather, right? So if we're thinking in terms of not just natures, but conditions, what we're interested in initially is what conditions do humans find themselves in on Earth? And just like we talked about the idea of taking things for granted because they've just always been that way, and to our experience, they're just a given. You can think of it like this, right? These are the conditions which make sense of these things, right? So both in the sense of you need to understand these things a little bit to see why humans do these things, right? Because these are activities, I'm sure. So I'm going to draw this on the bottom, right? So these are the activities, but these are the conditions, right? And last time I might have said something like, or used words like conditions of possibility. So these are the conditions, the human states that make sense of and make possible and sort of underlie these main activities. And these are the activities which Arendt is saying from time immemorial, we've just sort of thought of these as things that humans do. I guess next time we'll talk more specifically about contrasting it with the other things. But for now, these are the conditions for these things. They underlie these things. That's another way of thinking about what conditions are. And let's just talk about it, right? So what does she say about, right? So labor is the activity which corresponds, so another way of looking at these is that these correspond to each other in some way, right? To the biological process of the human body, whose spontaneous growth, metabolism, and eventual decay are bound to the vital necessities produced and fed into the life process by labor. The human condition of labor is life itself, right? So what did she say about life right there? Or what are some of the words, just in that paragraph, you can just focus on that, like those 4.5 lines. What are some words she associates with life or biology?
Like biological actions that an animal would do.
Yeah, so we definitely get like biological process, right? What other words? Of course, if we're interested in what this process is, right, it looks like it involves growth, metabolism, decay. That all seems to be part of that biological process. And they're bound to the vital necessities, right? The vital necessities of life, which are fed into the life process by labor, right? So let's do it this way. I don't know how you all are doing in terms of like, I'm sure a lot of you work or have worked or done some kind of work, right? Besides school, I mean, like, obviously that's work, but I mean like for a living, right? So you might or may not have come to this point in your life where one of these days you just sort of look at your bank account and you wonder, where did all my money go? Right? Anyone have that kind of like especially like I guess like when you're attaining something like some level of independence, like especially in undergrad, it's like, but still you may have to one day sit down soberly and budget. And you can, and if you mess that up, I think you can stand in awe before the abyss of your negative capital and say like, where did my money go? Where did our money usually go? It's not that difficult. I'm not asking for you to pull out receipts or anything, but where does our money usually go? Food, okay. And what happens to the food? We eat it, okay. And do we just accumulate infinite amounts of matter in our gut? What happens after we eat it? Okay, we expel it, right? That's where that money went. Okay. What about drinks on Northgate? Where did that money go? Clearly into the drinks, I realize that. And where did the drinks go? I mean, it was that one of those nights, maybe like on the floor, but really, of course, inside of us. And from there, where did it go? The toilet. So that's where that money went. Okay, but what about when, as I often enjoy doing, what about when we get stuff? Like your iPhone. Where did that money go? Hopefully it's still in your pocket or on your person, right? I mean, maybe perhaps with a cracked screen, perhaps with a few like dents or dints, it's not that time for that upgrade yet. But at least we have that to show. That money's in a sense still there, right? But in a lot of cases, okay, what about our gym membership? I mean, of course, there's the rec center, but all of that, whatever. Like, where did the services we get, what happens to those? Where did the Netflix money go? Okay, we experienced it, cool, right? So there's some of this where it's like, it doesn't always go in the toilet or manifest in stuff. Sometimes, although that's even more frustrating, it apparently goes nowhere. But the money went somewhere, right? So what we're getting at is that life means a lot of things to lots of people. But the sense in which we're going to be focusing on, and which Arendt's constantly going to be coming back to here, is that life is a biological process. And that biological process looks an awful lot like our metabolism, right? And you just like any little metabolism or anything, you feed the matter in one direction, it comes out another. Of course, the process is kind of gross if you really look at it that way, but that's what we're all doing all the time, right? Like, at least, depending on your level of health and depending on, of course, you know your body better than anyone, right? But at least once or twice a day, we come in contact with our own excrement. And that could very easily be to us a reminder of our condition in life, although that's kind of morbid. But life for Arendt is a biological process. And that means that the upkeep of that process is laborious. Like, can you imagine, like, of course, obviously the business still occurs because there are still farmers, right? But if we're wondering where our food went, right? Suppose that we're just hunter-gatherers living hand to mouth, right? There are no great civilizations yet. There are no castles. There are no iPhones. There's just the earth, which we have to work for our crops. And then we eat the crops. And what happens to them? Well, we know what happens to them, right? And then what happens? Winter comes, then the spring comes and the green things poke out. And what happens? We start it all over again. Does someone have a question? So one important point is that because life is a biological process, it's very closely related to our metabolism and to our necessities, right? If you get really philosophically proud and you're just like, I'm not going to poop anymore, how far are you going to get? Yeah, hopefully not too far before you finally faint and we cart you off to the hospital to extract from you the thing you wouldn't let go of, right? So, but because life is a biological process linked to our metabolism and to our necessities, it is laborious. The reason why we have to labor and why we've always had to labor is because life is laborious. In what other sense, we're going to talk about this later and further down the line, but in what other sense might it make sense to say that life is labor? Just think about the word labor, yeah?
To protect yourself.
Maybe. It definitely requires maintenance. You could say that in that sense, we're all very high maintenance creatures, and that's laborious. How else might labor be related to life?
Reproduction.
Say more. I mean, not too much more. Just like, what's the connection, right? Like, to reproduction. Okay, then definitely there's a certain kind of effort. Don't we call the birthing process labor? Life is labor, both in that from its very beginning, somebody had to labor to get it going, and until relatively recently in human history, very well could have died in the process. And every day from that moment on until when the process is finally over, and you don't have to poop anymore, right? Never thought we'd miss that, right? Until the process is over, it's laborious to upkeep. So in order to make sense of what the laboring activity is, and you have to recognize that life is a process, and that because it's a process, it requires labor. Do you see how they go together like that? Okay, now let's go back to the iPhone, because not everything of our labor or not everything that we do and make winds up in the toilet or in our memory, right? Because that's another place sometimes the money goes, right? We do have often, hopefully, the memories of the experiences, but we don't always just want to, like, we clearly aren't dung beetles constructing and saving and hoarding our excrement so as to be able to account for our budgeting. So not all the stuff we produce, we consume, right? And that's also just important, right? The biological process as a metabolic process linked to our necessity is always going to be related to consumption, right? You consume foods. You don't consume your cell phone, hopefully, right? So then what is the underlying condition that makes sense of work, or that work makes sense of? What are the words that she associates in the next paragraph with work?
Material things on the world.
Yeah, so that I've been saying stuff, but yeah, so material things, objects. Of course, materials are sort of tricky thing. There's clearly material involved in the life process, but here, yeah, like we're talking about material stuff like objects, right? Okay, and what are some of the adjectives? What in the first sentence, right? What's the adjective that she uses corresponding to that state of human existence? Remember last time we talked about artificial, right? And the artifice of the fact that, for instance, we all are sitting in an environment which is entirely man-made. Humans made the drywall and the insulation around us. They made the carpeting, they made everything. And all of that corresponds to what we could call the unnaturalness of our human condition. But that just means in contrast to the natural process, right? We did something that wasn't part of that natural process. Maybe at some point it kind of was, but through the process of work, we made objects, right? And we're now surrounded by the objects. So work provides an artificial world of things, distinctly different from all natural surroundings. Within its border, each individual life is housed, while the world itself is meant to outlast and transcend them all. So what does that mean? The world itself, this world of things, is meant to outlast and transcend the human lives that are housed in it. Do any of you hope to inherit your parents' house? I mean, difficult economic question, right? Like, we can fantasize if we need to, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice if your phone lasted more than a year? Right? And of course, as long as of course, with something like your phone, which is personal and you're kind of attached to, like, which is only for you, maybe it doesn't matter to you whether your phone's smashed the moment you pass away. But wouldn't it be nice if, for instance, large pieces of this campus were still here 50 years down the line? Maybe. I mean, then again, there are certain things, changes I might make. But the world, the literal world we live in that we've made, the stuff, very frequently, even though we've made it, outlasts us. How old are the streets, the roads? Sometimes, then again, all those with the college days, but generally, point is, I don't know. For all I know, much older than me, right? And that's sort of not just about, we'll talk again, I promise we'll talk about all this stuff to further down the line, but the whole point is that we can talk about the worldliness, like literally the worldiness of the fact that we've made these things, but part of what that provides for us literally is a world that is a little bit less ephemeral than the rainforest, right? Or where a little bit more than a grass hut, right? We can achieve some relative permanence so that it's very likely in many cases, in fact, the overwhelming number of cases, that wherever you're from, wherever you live, will very much still be there, perhaps grown, perhaps altered a little bit, but still be around whether or not you are. And that's slightly comforting, maybe. It depends on how interested you are in relative permanence. But that is what makes sense of work and worldliness, right? That not everything in nature, in fact, again, her point is that it's only humans who have made this kind of world of things, right? We could, of course, I guess, quibble about the beaver, right? Or the dung beetle. But for realsies, when we're talking about this, it's like the weird thing about humans, if we're trying to think about why are they different, is that we made this enormous, colossal, massive stuff. And we mean it not just as this cool, like, it's not like plumage. It's just only meant to get us a mate. It's also meant to like provide for a lot of other things, right? So that's worldliness, and that's how we make sense of work. So also you'll keep in mind, and this should be obvious, but if not, it'll be reiterated. That must mean that labor and work are different, right? In her sense, right? So where labor and work are different, and one of the ways, or clearly the ways in which they're different at this point, even at this early point in the book, is that one has to do with the fact that we're these metabolizing creatures that just literally keep eating and excreting until we die, right? And the process of that upkeep, even though it's kind of gross, it's very real, it's what we are, is what makes sense of why life can be laborious. But the worldliness, the fact that we make this semi-permanent world of things, is why we work, right? Now, action. Right, so what is the human condition of plurality? That might be one of the more difficult ones to sort of, shouldn't be, but it might be a little difficult to wrap your head around. So what's plural mean? Many, yeah, more than one, right? So yeah, many things. And in what sense is the human condition plural?
Boils down to it, there's more than one condition.
That's a good way of putting it. Like, for one hand, you'll notice that although this book is called The Human Condition, we're talking about three, right? So there's more than one human condition, and one sense in which the human condition is plural is that there is always more than one thing conditioning us at any moment, right? There's another sense in which our human condition is plural, and what is that sense? How many of us are there on this planet?
More than one.
Well, yes, more than one. And what's the rough estimate at the moment? Does anyone know?
7 billion.
Yeah, 7 point something billion. That's a lot of people. And so another reason why, for instance, bringing it to talk about the human condition rather than human nature is that in the old days, when we would talk about human nature, we would often talk about man, right? With a capital M. And in the singular. Because at that point in philosophical history, man is primarily an idea, right? And as Arendt will often say, but it's men and not man who lives on the earth. We can theorize and talk about man in the abstract if we want, but if we're being really realistic and we're trying to do justice to the facts of how we really experience things, there have always been others, right? Of course, in the various kind of legendary and mythological stories, in many cases, it's supposed or pretended that all of us really, came from one person. But that is, in just sheer biological terms, wildly implausible. And that's not to say that, the reason why those kind of stories, it's natural to have recourse to the idea of the one is, well, perhaps I shouldn't give that away. There are reasons why in the history of thought, people have tended towards thinking about the humans as man with a capital M. But Sensor Rent is trying to move us away from talking about nature as this one single thing. Humans inhabit the earth, not the idea of man, and there's always been others, right? Now, what about these others? Why is it so cool or interesting that there's others? Because there's certainly more ants on the earth than there are humans. That's, although in a certain sense fascinating, not nearly as titillating to me as the sheer idea of the number of humans. Why? Size, yeah. I mean, yeah, we couldn't sustain as many ants as there are if they weren't as tiny as they are. It's not just size, though. I'm not overawed by your size, most of you. Yeah, we are all different. And yet what? We're all different and yet what? In what sense are we the same? Yeah, so we're the same species. We can say we're all human. And yet, even though we're all human, it seems it has a different feel than the whole, like, they're all ants, right? And so what about this difference? How different are we? As different, really, to a certain extent, as snowflakes, right? Like, it's, on one hand, it's fun to rag on people, or to rag on people rather, who kind of, the whole, like, special snowflake slur, right? But there is something odd about the fact that you all are all individuals, right? That at least, there's this emotion you can feel called sonder, right? And sometimes it occurs to you whenever you're thinking about, it can occur to you whenever you're just thinking about the fact that, wow, there are so many people in the world. I wonder what their lives are like. Like, you see someone like traffic is slow or something, and you happen to be glancing around and you catch a glimpse of the person in the car next to you, like jamming out. And it's just like, what is it like to go home and be them? But at the same time, you know that that's kind of a fictitious idea. You're never going to know what it's like to be everybody. So even though there are billions of us, it's as though we all have our own little window out onto this big, wide world, which we recognize as different and filled with diversity, and it can all be a little much. And that feeling of being a little overwhelmed when you realize, I'm never going to meet everybody. I'm never going to even meet a fraction of them. It's like life as one big airport, right? Where everybody's bustling along their way, and it's kind of comforting. I happen to like being in airports, right? But at the same time, they're all off on their own journeys, and only small clusters of them at a time are actually going in the same places. And they're all different and individual and have this whole life story and journey ahead of them, about which you will know precious nothing after you finish staring at them and you get in line for your plane, right? So I'm just saying that's the word that you can use if you ever had that feeling. I might be just a weirdo, but we're all different in such a way. And she says this, and it's a great quote, like, where plurality is the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live, right? That's on page 8. Right, so these conditions, so we'll eventually come back to maybe later down the line, but whatever action is, and notice what she says about it too. So she's obviously thinking about it in a distinct way, because she says action, the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things or matter, corresponds to the human condition of plurality, the fact that men, not man, live on the earth and inhabit the world. Now, she says, so there's other ways we can talk about conditions, right? She says, not only, so plurality is specifically the condition of all political life, right? Not only the conditio sine qua non, does anyone know what that means? So the condition without which you don't get it, right? Like, for instance, the conditio sine qua non of reproducing sexually, for instance, is, wait for it, being the kind of being that can do that, right? Your mugs are never going to mate and make little saucers, right? So the idea of a conditio sine qua non is that there are, like, in the sense of being a requirement or a precondition or a stipulation, it's the conditio sine qua non is usually that without which you don't get the thing. So if there wasn't plurality, if humans weren't diverse as we are, if there was only one human or if all humans were the same, action wouldn't be a thing. for a rent in this sense, right? And so action is always going to, as we'll find out, action is always going to be closely related to politics for her, right? So at the same time, not only the conditio sine qua non, so if we didn't have plurality, we wouldn't have politics and we wouldn't have action, but it's also the conditio per quam, the condition through which we have politics and action. So somehow our individuality and the fact that there's so many of us and that we're all different, that's not only the reason why we're able to have action, it's how action actually occurs, right? Well, all of this will be explained in detail down the line, but that's what those things meant. That's what these conditions are. And that's what it is to say that these kind of correspond to each other. That one, you can't really make sense of these human activities, which we definitely do, without realizing these distinctions. But also, even looking at these distinctions themselves, they teach you a little bit something about stuff, right? The biological process, the question of why we have to labor to keep it going, the question of sort of why it's never ending, right? I mean, again, has anyone ever wondered, what if I could just take a pill that had all the nutrients I'd ever need and then never have to eat again? You might have thought that, particularly if you're into, like, I don't know, minimalism. But for most of us, it just doesn't occur as a burden. It's like, yeah, I have to eat, and yes, hunger is not bad, it's not a nice feeling. But again, coming back to the fact that not just in human terms, although it's very much a human thing, this whole plurality thing is really just part and parcel of our normal condition, right? Similarly, right, imagine eating the same thing every day. It had all the actual nutrients you needed, but it was the same thing every day. It happened to taste like peanut powder. I don't know. I might fast to death. I love peanut butter, but like the same thing, I don't know. So these are the underlying conditions which make possible and which make sense of, which underlie these activities. Now, these are all related, again, to even more fundamental human conditions. So again, this is a book about active life, about the human condition in this sense, and we're going to focus on these activities. But of course, there are even more fundamental human conditions that we face. What are those? What are the two even more general human conditions which we are sort of confronted by?
The questions that we went on,
Well, those, no, we should try to get to those. So yeah, I'll jump onto that really quickly. But even more generally than the fact that we have life as a natural process, we're upkeeping, work to give us stuff, plurality that makes possible action, there's also the fact that we're born and die, right? What were those two things sort of called for her? So mortality is related to, of course, the fact that we die. And natality is related to the fact that we're born. And natality also has the implication, of course, of being born for her. But what else kind of does she see in natality? Natality, as we're going to see, is for her is really closely related to action, and hence to politics. But even before that, there's a more general kind of thing about birthiness, being born, that she'll come back to a lot. What might that be? Often she'll talk about beginning, right? Or beginning anew, starting something new. Part of why natality, of course, is related to being born, and it's related to the fact that, as she says, there's this constant influx of strangers into the world. And what does that just mean? People are always being born. It was always the weirdest thing growing up, just because, again, when you're like small and like you can become sort of focused, obviously you can't help but be focused on your own thing. I don't know when it occurred to me, but when it did, it was just like, whoa. Like, actually, this is sort of messed up, right? So like with my little brother, who's like 3 years younger than me. So at some age, this shows you what kind of how philosophical I've been for how long. I was literally thinking, I'm just like, I existed for 3 years before you. Like, there are 3 years in which I existed and you didn't. Like, that's weird to think about. And as you grow older and as you kind of realize that the young people are still always young, you're just like, oh yeah, that's right. It's like there's an endless supply. So like we talked about last time, one of the givens of human nature is just that there's not only always others, but there's always more coming, right? And they have to come into the world and somehow make their place in it, just like everyone else. They have to learn, they have to develop. And so that process is always going on. And we're always on the cusp of beginning things anew, right? So making new beginnings is very closely related to what Arendt will mean by action and by politics. And those are both kind of all made sense of and made possible by the fact we're able to make sense of it because people are always being born. Similarly, people are always dying. And that also is important for our thought. As you'll see, and as I think, right. So Arendt's going to generally always sort of say that natality is the central category of political thought. And that's almost basically just half of what this book's about. And then in philosophical, or what she'll call metaphysical thought, is about mortality, right? We'll talk about why down the line. But so that's that connection, and these are also conditions of these are also part of the human condition, right? The fact that we're born and we die. So not too crazy, right? We're just talking about very general things that are largely applicable to all of us and have been for a long time, right? We've always been in a world in which we've had to sustain the life process, which begins with birth until it ends in death. And in the meantime, we try to work to make some durable stuff that will hopefully last a bit longer than the rainy season. And at the same time, as we'll talk about, there's also this action thing, which is kind of interesting. But really quickly moving on, because we don't have a lot of time. So traditionally, the question about human nature, as I said, the question about philosophical anthropology, or the so-called anthropological question, has been posed in terms of what is man. And Arendt tries to show, or why, even if we, kind of what she's done in the second half of this section, has been, after having talked about human conditions, someone might be reading this. Again, someone familiar with philosophical history, me wondering, like, why are we talking about conditions? I want to talk about human nature. Well, human nature has those two versions. The question of human nature has those two versions. What are the two sort of iterations of the question of human nature? I think Ryan brought it up earlier.
Who are we? Or who is, like, who am I?
Right, so and most broadly, one could be the question of what is the human? And if you were aiming that at yourself, you'd have to ask, what am I? And the other is, who is the human, or who am I? Right? And why should these be so difficult to answer, especially together?
I think she said like the only person who could define man would be a god if there is a god.
Sure, and why might that be? Like, why would that be? I mean, I can answer it. We're running low on time, but like, why would that be? I mean, it's cool to say, but why should naming or defining the human be so difficult?
Is it because we're ever changing?
That's at least one possibility, right? But if we try to account for our always ever changingness in terms of natures, things get wonky. But if we're talking about condition, right? Again, we can talk about conditioning and like the training or the getting used to the sort of changing, then that might be another way of doing it. So conditions might account for our changes better. But what's so difficult about defining things?
Like we didn't make ourselves.
Yeah, so it's the metaphor she uses, right? That it would be like jumping over our own shadow. So defining things is just a fancy way of, etymologically, of setting limits. or we sometimes say demarcating, right? Delimiting, all of those sort of mean the same thing. So defining has also been closely related to naming. Sorry, to naming. I swear. So there's a story from the Bible, right, where at the very beginning, naturally, the one human who was there, you see how this kind of story goes, he is invited to name all the animals, right? And that, although you could just think of it as a cute way of explaining where all the names of the animals came from, is linked to the idea in that part of the Bible where it's said that man has dominion over the earth, right? The dominion over the earth is exemplified by the ability and the prerogative to define things, right? We don't know what lions call themselves, and we don't care, right? Like, we have never consulted the things of nature regarding how we're going to interact or deal with or define or label it, right? And that, I mean, whether or not you think that's right and whether we should have, the whole point is that we humans are the namey things. It's like table, coffee, and of course we can get really scientific about it. But for that self-same reason, the same way that you've never seen your eyes with your own eyes, and that it doesn't really count to look in a mirror because you're looking at the mirror, right? In the same way, it would be surprising if the namey thingies were so good at that they could somehow get around to actually naming, that is to say, defining themselves. It's part and parcel of what we are, that if you get how it is we're doing, if you get what it is to define a nature and an essence, that it would be really kind of silly to think that we'd get as far as doing that for our very own selves. So in a certain way, you could also say that it might be because there's something so different about human nature that only a God could define it, or it could also just be the fact that it would be odd for us to name ourselves, right? All of that may not have made sense, but we'll come back to it. See you guys Wednesday.